Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. My guest today is perhaps this country's former economist, Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago, of Newsweek magazine, and of wherever it is that persons of brilliance and concern gather to discuss the fate of individual liberty in the midst of ever-expanding governmental responsibilities. Well, that's the way I introduced Professor Friedman on The Open Mind 2 years ago. Since then, he has been as brilliant, has delighted still more discerning citizens of the world, has become a Nobel Laureate, and is here today to pick up where we left off. Professor Friedman, we were saying 2 years ago, literally we left off on the road to serfdom. I was looking back at the transcript of our program together, and we did leave off on the road to serfdom, the road to an overabundance of governmental interference in the lives of most individuals. And you said, I really do think that chance is a good deal less than 50% that we'll be able to avoid it. And by avoiding it, you were referring to this road to serfdom. Now, 2 years later, have you changed your mind? Is it still 50%? Is it 40%, 60%, or what?
I am sorry to say that I haven't changed my mind. I wish I could say I had in a favorable direction. I think the odds at the moment are still less than 50%. In the past 2 years, there have been some favorable developments from this point of view and some unfavorable ones. If you start with the unfavorable ones first, the developments in Great Britain have been very unfavorable from this point of view. Britain has been in an increasing crisis economically, and that is threatening the political stability of Great Britain. Great Britain, after all, is a fount for most of our ideas on political freedom and liberty, and if Britain were to go, that would not be a good thing from the point of view of the world as a whole, or the U.S. in particular. On the continent of Europe, Italy and France seem to be on the verge of moving toward governments in which the Communist Party will either be dominant or will play a large role. They may yet escape that fate, but certainly the possibility of that development today is larger than it was 2 years ago. At home in the United States, on the unfavorable side, the energy program development is, from a fundamental point of view, the most threatening at the moment to the preservation of a free society.
Why do you say that?
Because the plans that are being made, the programs that are being offered with respect to it, are programs fundamentally for nationalizing, or the equivalent of nationalizing, the production, distribution, consumption of energy. If you look at the program that has been proposed by various groups, not necessarily only those by the Carter administration, they are programs for turning over control over the production and distribution of energy to governmental bureaucracies. That's a move in the direction of a corporate state. It's a move in replacing private initiative and voluntary action by compulsory governmental action. Those are the unfavorable developments. On the favorable side, if I may start with what I think has been the most favorable development of the past 2 years, and one that many people will not find favorable, it's been what's happened in New York City. Now, that's very unfavorable for the citizens of New York.
Tell me about that. I am a citizen of New York.
But for the country as a whole, it's been the most dramatic element that has shaken the confidence of the public at large in the virtues of big government, of paternalistic government, of social welfare measures. Here is New York City, the most welfare state-oriented electorate in the country. The city which has the largest government spending per person. A city which has the greatest problems of any city in the country, in which government spending, far from solving problems, has created or exacerbated them. Now, from the point of view of the public at large, the experience of Britain should have been just as great a cautionary tale. But Britain is a long way off. It's a different country. New York is close to home. Everybody knows about New York and is aware of New York. And therefore, the problems of New York City have had, I think, a very healthy effect on the attitudes of the public at large toward the role that government should play in their lives. Similarly, on a wide range of other issues, there has been increasing disillusionment with what government can accomplish. We all know from all the polls that governmental agencies, whether it be the Congress or the White House or the bureaucracy, rank very low in public esteem. There has been a gathering tax revolt, a gathering reaction against big spending by government. It is this reaction against big spending, this decline in confidence that the way to solve a problem is to throw government money at it, which has been the major political force behind what commentators have been describing as Mr. Carter's fiscal conservatism. Now, that's a good trend. Much more fundamental and much more important, potentially, from the long run, is what's been happening in the world of ideas. The ideas of socialism, of collectivism, of central planning, of the welfare state, which were for so long the dominant ideology of the intellectual community, have become increasingly discredited. That line of thinking is dead. It has nothing to offer to a young, hopeful man who is trying to look for something to believe in and to have faith in. The ideas of individualism, of freedom, of each person doing his own thing, the idea that maybe you have a better society if people tend to their own knitting rather than everybody trying to tend to everybody else's. Those ancient and honorable ideas are having a resurgence. They have a much better hearing today on campuses, among the intellectual community in general, than they did even as short a time ago as 2 years. That intellectual development, I think, is all to the good. But whether it will be able to stop the road to serfdom, stop us from going all the way down to the road to serfdom, is a real question, because once you get a avalanche going, if that's the right image, once you get a big car going down the road, it has an enormous amount of inertia. And it takes something really to stop it and turn it around. And the real problem is whether the changing climate of ideas can take effect soon enough before it is overwhelmed by the onrushing behemoth of the state.
Professor Friedman, I'm interested in what you say as what you see as a shift in ideas away from the welfare state, away from socialism, away from statism. Yet I had the occasion recently to look at a series of reports that indicated what citizens in this fair city, New York, were thinking about, what they were concerned about. And I was fascinated to note, now this isn't 2 years ago, this is very recently, to note that they are still concerned about the services that they want, additional services. They want more, they want more, they want more. And perhaps on the campuses, perhaps you and your friends are terribly much aware of what the gimmies have done to us. But what indication is there that really, at the depth of the society, at the basic level of this society, people are moving away from an insistence upon more and more social services?
Well, maybe there isn't, and maybe you're right, in which case that pessimistic evaluation that we started out with is supported. But I think one must distinguish between common opinion at a moment and the underlying movement of intellectual ideas, which only determines common opinion after a very long lag. Now, of course, most people, most times, would like to get something for nothing. They are always have the gimmies, in your very evocative term. But yet, and maybe New York, of course, is exceptional. As I said before, New York is the most welfare-oriented electorate in the country. And yet, even the people in New York, I suspect, are more aware than they were before about the price, the cost, the consequences of trying to get things by that device of getting it through government. Undoubtedly, the majority of the people have not been moved. General public ideas are much slower to move than intellectual ideas. That's a fortunate thing. The public at large never moved as far in the direction of socialism and collectivism as the intellectual community did. They preserved a kind of a stability which kept us from going even faster than we did. One of the reasons, in my opinion, why Britain went so much faster toward a completely socialized state than we have gone, is because the intellectual and ruling communities in Britain are more homogeneous and more nearly one, while fortunately we have a much more diversified and varied set of elites. So I think the public at large never went as far as the intellectuals in that direction. And I'm sure they are slow in turning around and going back the other way. I'm not saying that there has been any major trend in the public opinion at large, but only that in the intellectual community, in the community of the youngsters, the young people who are coming up, no change in the older ones either. You know, human beings have certain very common characteristics. It's very hard for anybody to change his mind after he's gotten to the age of 25 or 30. He gets set in his ways. It's always fascinating to me. I had an interview this morning, a radio interview, with a group of youngsters from a radio program called Focus on Youth. They were lively, energetic, bright. They were a wonderful group. They had a guest book in which they asked me to write a message in my name. And so the message I wrote was, how is it that these bright, energetic, brilliant, dynamic young people turn within such few years into such deadly dull, unimaginative, unactive adults?
I mean, the rest of us.
The rest of us, all of us. You've noticed this, I'm sure. You're on the campus on Rutgers. Haven't you always been impressed by the contrast between the liveliness and active minds of the young graduate students and of their and the opposite on the part of the settled, permanent tenure instructors?
Well, we could argue that point out, Professor Friedman, at some point.
I don't want to overstate it. There's an element to it. Well, going back to the main point, I believe it is true that I am sure you're right, that many people still believe that government owes them something. The point is that the first step in people's conversion is never with respect to their own privileges, but always with respect to somebody else. Everybody always knows he's an exception. You ask people, do you think government should be cut down to size? Oh, of course. How about the program you benefit from? Oh, well, that's a special case. That needs more money. So I don't believe there's any contradiction between people saying, gimme, on the one hand, and these same people voting or acting in another capacity so as to hold down the rate of growth of the state.
You know, I would ask you the same question that I asked you a couple of years ago, and that is, why do you hold on, as it seems to me you do, hold on almost for dear life, to a kind of optimism, despite all the things that you see and comment on in front of you? Why not recognize the situation for what it is, as you describe it so well, and then perhaps point ourselves in a different direction?
Down the same road. There is no different direction down that road. Don't kid yourself. There just is no different direction down that road. This isn't a strange road. We, you and I, who have been lucky enough to have been born in a free society, take freedom for granted as if it's a natural phenomenon. But let me ask you, what fraction of the human race today lives in free societies?
Tiny, tiny, tiny percentage.
Over history, what fraction at any moment of time ever lived in free societies?
Even tinier.
Even tinier.
I'm leading you down the garden path, Professor Friedman.
No, you're not. No, you're not. It is true that the normal condition of mankind is tyranny and misery. We've escaped. We've been extraordinarily fortunate to escape into an island of freedom and prosperity. If we do not maintain that island of freedom and prosperity, if we do not maintain the essential features of the society which made that freedom and prosperity possible, there isn't a wide range of alternatives. We go to misery and tyranny, to the normal state of mankind. Why am I optimistic? Because we're all so ignorant. If we could really predict the future, you couldn't be optimistic. But we've seen historically, time and again, that people who have tried to make long-range predictions have not been very good at it. The human race is a funny thing. It's always turning up surprises on you. People are capable of doing things you wouldn't have expected to them, of rising to the circumstance. And I suppose I maintain my optimism partly because my innate character is optimistic, but partly because the consequences of not recognizing our state of affairs, of not acting in time to check it, seem to me so horrendous that I cannot but believe that as people realize the alternative before them, they won't take measures to make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, what took us into this little island of time in which we're so different, or have enjoyed a difference from all the history of mankind?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that can be spread more broadly. It's a subject I've been very much interested in. From time to time in man's history there have been golden ages. 5th century B.C. in Greece, the Renaissance in Italy, first Elizabethan period in England, the 19th century in Britain. We're in the midst of what I regard as a golden age in the United States, 19th and early 20th century. Now the interesting question is, how is it here, to take it out of our own context, here's the Greek peninsula. I refer to it as Peloponnesian, and somebody reminded me I should not, that it's, what is it? It's a different peninsula. At any rate, the area where Greece
We'll accept it as such.
Okay. It was the same people there in the 6th century B.C. and in the 5th century B.C. The same people in the 4th century as in the 5th century. Why is it in the 5th century you had this sudden flowering, this enormously productive and brilliant period? It disappears in the 4th, 3rd, 2nd century B.C. Why is it? Same people. Well, I think in many ways the fundamental explanation, and now I'm simplifying and conjecturing, this isn't a solid, well-sustained hypothesis, is that some accident comes along which wipes the slate clean of restraints that have been holding people back. In our own golden age, it's very clear what that was. It was a new continent, with new people coming, with a new form of government, with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. It was a opportunity in which people were unrestrained and in which the natural instincts for people to improve their lot were given freest and fullest rein. Now what happens, and the reason these golden ages tend to be relatively brief, the reason they last 100 years, 150 years at most, is that as time passes, the slate gets filled up. It's very much easier to introduce restrictions and restraints than it is to remove them. It's easier to pass a law than it is to repeal a law. And so over the course of time, you tend to impose these chains and restraints on yourselves, mostly for good reasons. The initial objectives are always good. That doesn't mean the outcome is. And finally, the slate becomes so filled up, if I may continue to use that image, that there's no more room to write on. And you need somehow something which will provide for another removal of restraints.
What do you think would provide now for a tabula rasa, again, a wiping clear of the slate?
Well, I think the first thing that's necessary to wipe clear the slate is to set a limit to government spending. The thing that has been encroaching more and more upon that slate is that whereas until 1928 or 9, total government spending in the United States, federal, state, and local, never exceeded 10% of our income, except in the Civil War and the First World War. It has now risen to over 40% of our income. If that continues, we're through. 40% is an awful lot. In Britain now, it's reached somewhere between 50 and 60%. And the first necessity, I think, as a tactical matter, is to set an end to that. As a strategic matter, the main necessity is to have a change in the intellectual climate of opinion, which will substitute a belief in individual responsibility for the false belief in social responsibility. Now let me emphasize, the problems that have arisen to us have not come from evil people who were trying in a conspiracy or anything like that to enslave us. That hasn't been our problem. Our problems have arisen from good people who are trying to do good, but trying to do good in a fundamentally flawed way. The welfare state is in many ways a noble construct, a noble concept. It's the concept that we ought to help our fellow men. What flaws it is that it's one thing for you to help me out of your pocket. It's another thing for you to help me out of his pocket. And the fundamental flaw of the welfare state, in my opinion, is the idea that you should do good with somebody else's money. Now, what's wrong with that? Two things are wrong. In the first place, nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. We talked about New York City. About 7 or 8 years ago, I've forgotten exactly when it was, Kenneth Galbraith, in an article in the New York Magazine, said there were no problems in New York that could not be solved by the city spending enough money. My memory serves me right, he said by doubling New York's budget. Well, in the meantime, New York's budget has quadrupled, and the problems have gotten worse, not better. And that's cause and effect. Because when you say spend more money, whose money? The city of New York spent more money, but where did it get it? From its citizens. There was no more money in total to be spent. But nobody spends somebody else's money as careful as he spends his own. So you had more money being spent carelessly and less money being spent carefully. In the second place, equally important, you cannot spend somebody else's money unless you first get it. How do you get it? Ultimately and fundamentally by sending a policeman to take it away from them. So the concept of doing good with somebody else's money has force or coercion built into it as an essential feature. And those flaws, the waste which arises out of spending somebody else's money and the coercion which is unavoidable, destroy the good in the idea of doing good and convert it into doing bad.
I'm interested in your second point because I've wondered, as you were addressing yourself to the subject, I've wondered whether it would be the philosophical climate that's created, that of the policeman who comes and takes those tax monies, those funds, or is your opposition that of the economist? Is it that of the economist or that of the philosopher? Can we distinguish between them?
We can distinguish between them very much. The economist, as economist, I can say what will be the consequences of doing something or other. As an economist, if you say to me, let me take a New York City problem. If I analyze to you the disastrous consequences of rent control in New York City, the effect which that has had on the deterioration of buildings, on the abandonment of buildings, on a reduction in the tax base, on slums. All of that is a predictable consequence of rent control. It's a straight matter of technical economics. It can be shown to have occurred wherever rent control was introduced, whenever it was introduced, whether in Britain or in France or anywhere, it doesn't matter. That's purely a technical consequence of rent control. On the other hand, if I say, regardless of the consequences, it is morally wrong for a government official to force me to rent a piece of property to you for less than the price at which I would voluntarily rent it, at that point I am now speaking as a man with values and philosophy. That is to say, you have both principle and expediency involved. The economist talks to the expediency. The philosopher, the ethicist, the human being talks to the principle.
Now, the philosophers may disagree. Do the economists on this question of rent control and its relationship to New York?
On rent control, there's no disagreement whatsoever. Oh, on most of the interesting thing is the public at large believes that economists disagree. The fact is that on the technical subject of most technical subjects in economics, you'll find almost no disagreement. Right. Rent control is certainly one example in which I will challenge you to find from the professional economists from the left to the right, I will challenge you to find anybody who will defend rent control from a technical economic point of view.